This episode is brought to you by Redfin. You're listening to a podcast, which means you're probably multitasking. Maybe even scrolling home listings on Redfin, saving homes without expecting to get them. But Redfin isn't just built for endless browsing. It's built to help you find and own a home. With agents who close twice as many deals, when you find the one, you've got a real shot at getting it. Get started at redfin.com. Own the dream.
The views, assumptions, and opinions expressed by the Geo Godfather hosts, guests, and callers on the program are strictly their own and do not necessarily represent the opinions or beliefs of Electrocast Media.
They didn't help Hamas even slightly. That Hamas, at the end of the day, found itself facing Israel without any Iranian help. Then the same is about Hezbollah. And here it is more, more problematic from the Iranian point of view. That was the pillar of their proxy system. And they were not there to help Hezbollah. And then the collapse of the Syrian regime, which was the most important country for the old dreams of the Iranians, they lost it.
Welcome to the Geo Godfather Wars, the real talk on understanding how geopolitics impacts you and your world. I'm your host, Barak Sina, founder of Strategic Intelligentsia and the Gulf Futures Forum. Thank you for joining me as we take a deep dive behind the topics affecting the world we live in today. Welcome everybody to the report launch of Regime Collapse in Iran, a Necessity for Regional Security. The report that I have just recently written identifies the fact that despite the strategic setbacks that Iran had faced as a result of the 12-day war, which were significant, Iran has managed to swiftly reconstitute itself. It's established another command and control for itself. While it's been set back in its nuclear program, it remains committed to exporting terrorism and reconstituting its nuclear program because that is the very identity of the regime itself. It perceives these malign activities as essential for its survivability. Therefore, it's just simply a matter of when is going to be round two of a conflict between Israel and Iran, or Iran and US assets in the region. The report concludes that military intervention alone is insufficient because that will create a rallying around the flag effect. Military intervention must be coupled with extensive sharing of logistical resources and support to the Iranian opposition in order to avoid a vacuum of governance in the event of regime collapse and to facilitate a smooth transition that should be led internally. Regime collapse is very, very different to regime change. We have an absolutely fantastic panel today. We have Major General Tal Kelman, former head of Strategic Planning and Cooperation Directorate, J5 at the IDF, where he served as the head of the Iran Directorate. Major General retired Yaakov Amidror, who's former National Security Advisor. Ambassador Elliot Abrams, former Special Representative for Iran and Venezuela in the first Trump administration and former Deputy National Security Advisor. And Sima Shine, head of the Iran program INSS and former head of Research and Evaluation Division of Mossad. Before we begin, I would also like to extend my appreciation to Dr. Avner Golov and Shaked Ben Elia from Mind Israel that conducted an external review of the report. So my appreciation goes out to you. May I ask, Sima, would you like to start off with your thoughts?
Yes, please. Thank you for inviting me. It's really an excellent panel. I'll start by saying that I think there is no dispute on the fact that if and when there is a change of regime in Iran, the whole Middle East would look differently. Of course, the question would be in what direction the change will be. And I think this might be one of the issues that we have to tackle during our conversation. How should we support if there are circumstances for a change? What should be supported? How should be supported in order to develop in the right direction and not into, for instance, a military coup of the IRGC or something like that. So I think there is common understanding and acceptance of the fact that Iran is a destabilizing factor in the Middle East. It was like that in the past. It is today. And as we can see in the last several months, it's also a factor in Europe. Just 2 days ago, we saw in Australia, but before it was in London and in Italy and in Germany. The governments in those countries have decided that Iran is acting in the civil society of those countries in a way that is determined to, the goal is to destabilize the internal situation in those countries. So Iran is much beyond the Middle East. Its effect of activity is much beyond the Middle East. And therefore, I think there is not only in the Middle East, but also in Europe and in other places as the US and Australia, understanding that Iran, the current regime in Iran, is something that bothers not only Israel, but many others. So that's one point I want to mention. The other one, I would say, we already see in Iran the ongoing debate inside the regime, but much more around the regime, people that are not part of the regime, but are very connected to the regime, both in the more conservative camp, as well as the more pragmatic one, asking themselves what has to be done in order to bring, first of all, as a result of the 12 days war, and what was revealed as the weakness of Iran in different aspects, and what should be done in order to be in a better position in the future. And what is interesting in this debate, from my point of view, is the fact that all of them, in both camps, are pinpointing to the issue of the relations between the regime and the population, understanding that the gap that is between these two, the regime on one side and most of the population on the other side, this gap cannot be continued. And if the regime wants to improve its capabilities and if it wants to improve its preparedness to the future. So I want to just to open with these two remarks and come back later after others. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Before I move on to the next speaker, I wanted to ask you, Sima, when you speak about these pragmatic and reformist regime members, something that I speak about is the regime being able to, in a sense, co-opt the opposition and, to a great degree, misdirect the West by presenting a false dichotomy of hardliners and reformers. When we actually look at the reformers themselves, they are all committed to reconstituting the nuclear program. They're all committed to demonizing Israel and the US. They may pay lip service to domestic social reform. However, when it comes to the foreign policy calculus, it remains exactly the same. And indeed, former President Rouhani, he has boasted in the past of being able to conduct negotiations with the West over the Iranian nuclear program while at the same time advancing it. So when we are attempting to predict what's coming next within Iran, are we being blindsided by giving too much faith to the so-called reformers that are part of the regime?
So first of all, you are very correct in describing the situation. I would say I use the word pragmatists because I don't think they are reformists. And that's the big difference. I think they understood, and Rouhani with the JCPOA 2015, he was not a reformist, he was a pragmatist. He understood that the economic situation in Iran is very dear, as it even less even today is much more than it was at that time. And he understood that in order to make sure that the system stays and can survive, he needs to bring the removal of sanctions. And therefore, it's pragmatism. It's not in any way.
But it's not coupled, though, with actual change in its foreign policy calculus. It wants to have sanctions relief while maintaining exporting terrorism, while maintaining its nuclear aspiration. It's pragmatic at best in tone and style, but not in substance.
So on that, I would say two things. One, he was willing to roll back the program for a while in order to get what was needed very much for him to the state at that time. So that's, in my opinion, is pragmatism. That's one thing. And the other one is, which is very important as also to mention, is Iran is a very, very unique system. It's not, in this case, I completely agree that it doesn't change dramatically the foreign policy. And of course, it doesn't change terror activity because all the terror activities are within the responsibility of the IRGC, who are responsible only to the leader. In no way the president is involved in what they are doing. And in some cases, I saw in the past that they have been doing things in order to divert the direction of what they saw that the president was trying to go, the direction he was trying to promote. So I think it's completely correct to say.
Could you just expand on that last point? That's a very interesting point. Could you please just amplify?
Yeah. For instance, there are many cases. During a dialogue with the Europeans, suddenly there is a terror activity somewhere in Europe. When the issue of supporting Russia in the Ukraine war, Iran tried to say that there was a dialogue with the West that was trying to push Iran not to send missiles after they have already supported with the UAVs. There was a kind of an understanding between the two sides that there was a thinking of that there is an understanding. The first shipment of missiles was transferred to Russia. My understanding without the knowledge of the president.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Sima. I will just take Tal Kelman next.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Barak, and great to see the panelists and to be online. First of all, I want to say that I think talking about the regime today, I think that whenever we discuss Iran, we need to have in the back of our heads the fact that the holistic challenge that Israel has, and I think not only Israel, from Iran has four main pillars. And when we talk about strategy towards Iran, we need to think in four main pillars. Regime is one of them. It hasn't been, I think, for the past years in foreign policy, in Israeli policy, in American policy. But I think we need to always to remember that, there's the nuclear issue, which is obviously the most severe, most dangerous existential threat for Israel. Has been and could be in the future, depending on what the developments will be in the next, few months or maybe few years after the previous war. The second thing is the conventional military balance in the Middle East. Iran does not only have the potential nuclear program, it has a very advanced conventional military capabilities that are a very severe threat on Israel. The third, I would say, is the regional posture, meaning the Iranian influence and the Iranian military proxies in the Middle East. And on the other side, vice versa, Israel's blending into the Middle East, Israel's partners in the Middle East and the regional issue. And the fourth is the regime. So the regime is a part of a more complex way to look at the challenge and also a way to look at the strategy. I think for many years, and basically when these are huge challenges, these are long-term challenges, but I think the core issue, obviously, is the regime. It's the most, I think, difficult issue to deal with, but it is the core issue. Israel does not have a direct dispute with the Iranian people. We had very good relationships with the Iranian people till 1979, and since the revolution, there is a regime, an extreme regime, that is driving Iran to a very, very aggressive approach towards the region, towards other countries, but also towards obviously the US and Israel. And I think it needs to be part of our policy. Now, the problem is that it is complicated. I, first of all, very much like the way you stated the issue as the regime collapse and not regime change. I think the words regime change create a fear of touching the issue, because first of all, regime change is, I think when you deal with a regime, you need to have a strategy that's long-term. You need to have patience, and you need to combine many efforts. It's not only a military effort, it's diplomatic, it's economical, it's information operations, and it's also military. You need to have a combination of these efforts and need to be holistic, and you need to have strategic patience. The Iranians, I would say for them, they have strategic patience. Israel is not a country that strikes to have a lot of strategic patience. And this is an issue that you need this for that. That's one thing. The second thing is that when you say regime change, what are you changing into? The alternative could be much worse than this one. And I also totally agree with the fact that it's not between the reformists or the extreme, because it's a regime, it's the basic ideology of this regime, whether it be Rouhani or it be Khamenei, is the same. The difference is about the approach. And I think the issue is that we need to put it on the table. What we saw in the past, and I think at this present, the 12-day war that we had with Iran brought Iran to a T-junction. Iran has a very difficult dilemma. Does it go to the area of agreement, de-escalation, even if it's to give up some of its goals, at least for the short term, or does it go to a non-agreement environment and potential for escalation? In Israel for many years, and I still hear this today, people talk, the Israelis need to choose. We need to choose, are we going for the nuclear issue or are we looking at the regime? I don't think it's this or this. I think we need to do both. I think we need to challenge the regime puts vis-a-vis Israel, but at the same time, we need to deal with the nuclear, because it's not as if we go to a nuclear agreement, sanctions, there is some sort of sanction relief from Iran, you cannot go to a long-term regime collapse strategy. Now, how to do that? What are the areas that you can focus on? I think I'll leave it to the next part of the discussion. But I think my main message is, yes, it needs to be on the table. It needs to be a coordinated strategy. Israel, US, I would hope it would be also with the E3 as much as possible, but mainly Israel and the United States. And I think there's a lot to be done there that hasn't been done in past years.
Thank you. Look, I appreciated very much your thoughts on how Iran is attempting to reconstitute its conventional capabilities and it being at a T junction, even in terms of what its regional posture is going to be. What is your take? On a separate note, my report attempted to be holistic in that approach, that multi-pronged approach. I get the fact that culturally Israel is very, very good at striking at threats as they emerge. But in terms of that holistic approach of causally addressing the root of the problem, which is the regime itself, it's not part of its cultural mindset. But to what extent do you see Iran attempting to reconstitute its conventional capabilities? And to what extent is it maintaining its strategic calculus in the region?
Well, first of all, I think, if I want to use a phrase, I think the jury is still out. I mean, it's only been a few months since the 12-day war. The Iranians in the past, and what we've learned about them, is that they don't take decisions from the gut. They usually think, they have their processes, and I think it's being calculated now. I have the big, I don't think they'll give up any of the three pillars. I don't think they'll totally give up the pillar of the nuclear program. I don't think they'll give up the conventional capabilities. I don't think they'll give up the regional. The question will be the balance between them and the investment in each one of them. I think basically Iran for many years has been going, the nuclear was the lead, or the proxies were the lead, and then came the nuclear and then the conventional. But I think after the 12-day war, they now have to calculate how they balance between the three. And that means sometimes taking the timeline and thinking, okay, maybe I will postpone nuclear aggressive, like go into agreement for a few years, believing that they could bring that in 10 or 15 years. And in the meantime, build conventional. I think one of the Iranian lessons learned from the 12-day war is that the conventional threat is a very, very severe threat, especially for Israel with its geographic and I would say population, the geography of Israel, the size of Israel. I think that's a lesson learned, even though the effectiveness of the ballistic missile capabilities were under their expectations. They're clever, they'll learn, they'll have lessons learned, and I don't think they're going to give that up very easily.
I mean, before we go to the next speaker, just the one comment I would have, or rather the two comments, are that the fact that Iran is attempting to maintain these three pillars and maintain its strategic calculus could be severely undermined if President Trump is successful at enhancing the Abraham Accords. Iran may be more isolated as a result of that. And it just sort of really feeds into my original point that it's the nature of the regime that really drives its strategic calculus, in that its rationality is not about cost-benefit analysis. We're going to abandon this strategic calculus in order to be accepted by the region. We don't want to incur those losses. Its rationality is predicated on its identity to the point that it wants to maintain these three pillars, but the question remains how to sequence it, and hence the enduring threat. Yaakov, is it possible for you to please share your thoughts?
Yeah. First, I want to emphasize that Iran didn't deliver not only in those 12 days. The beginning of showing its incapacity begin in Gaza. They didn't help Hamas even slightly. The Hamas, at the end of the day, found itself facing Israel without any Iranian help. Then the same is about Hezbollah. And here it is more problematic from the Iranian point of view. That was the pillar of their proxies system. And they were not there to help Hezbollah. Then the collapse of the Syrian regime, which was the most important country for the old dreams of the Iranians, they lost it. And they were not there to help. And at the end of the day, they didn't succeed to defend Iran, and the Israeli Air Force was above the skies of Iran like it is above the skies of Gaza Strip. And I don't know what will be the impact of the fact that this regime didn't deliver. Didn't deliver in Gaza, didn't deliver in Lebanon, didn't deliver in Syria, and at the end didn't deliver in Iran itself. And I'm speaking about one aspect. At the same time, they don't deliver domestically, lack of water, energy, electricity, and so on and so forth. So the combination of both, fading of the Iranian strategic structure outside Iran, and the fact that they don't succeed to provide the people of Iran what they feel that they should have, I don't know what will be the combination impact of those facts. The problem that we are facing when we speak about regime change, and some of us speaking about it many years, is the fact that there is no any organized opposition in Iran. If there is an opposition, it is within the system, and that not the opposition which will collapse the regime. And the fact that there is no opposition and there is no any group that you can say, okay, I'll take this group, I help them, I'll provide them with all you wrote in your paper. There is not such an organization, no such group that you can help to emphasize, to enhance their capabilities. There are spreading issues in which the demonstrations in Iran, from the truck drivers demonstration to the hijab movement. But at the end, there is no organized opposition. There is no leadership that you can promote. And I think that this is why it is not so easy to speak about it. It's easy to speak. It's not so easy to do something leading to regime change or regime collapse. And we don't know if it will be a collapse or change. It's too early. What we can do probably is to bring more problems into the street, to make the regime more shaky because of those problems, but without an organized opposition that you can help. And when the regime is still ready to take all the needed measures, including using the Basij in a very tough way, in spite of the fact that they didn't deliver strategically and domestically, today we have to work very hard, and it will take a long time to build any basis, any structure that can help the Iranians to get rid of their own despots. It is not going to be easy because the lack of opposition in one side and the readiness of the regime to take strong measures on the other side, but it is something that should be done, as was said by the previous speaker, by both Israel and America and maybe European countries. I'm not sure that they will be ready to take any active actions here and there. Maybe we can get some help from the Gulf countries under the radar, but I'm very pessimistic about our ability to build something which lead to a regime change or collapse, but we should begin it. Maybe through the way when we will be there, we will find new opportunities, and maybe if we will be there, more forces within the Iranian people will come out and will be the beginning of a change in this regime, because I fully agree with all those who emphasize the fact that today the regime in Tehran is the most aggressive, one of the two most aggressive forces in the Middle East and leading to destabilization. The other one is the Muslim Brotherhood Sunni extreme movements, but these are the two groups which are leading to destabilization of the Middle East.
Life is hard, but finding a really great podcast makes the days go by so much easier. Hi, my name is Blue Telusma. I'm a writer, an emotional intelligence coach, and the host of Humanize with Blue Telusma, a podcast where we believe that when you humanize everyone in the room, a great conversation is almost guaranteed. Join us every week here on Electricast as me and my guest co-hosts unpack big topics and interview even bigger personalities with a sense of humor and a dash of mischief. If you're looking for a new best friend in your head, we've got you covered. Electricast.
First of all, thank you so much, Yaakov, for your thoughts. I want to just comment on two of them. First of all, it's really interesting that you spoke about the fact that whether it be for Hamas or Hezbollah being sufficiently degraded, that Iran wasn't there to shore them up. And we see that autocrats behave like that. You know, on one hand, we are afraid in the West of the axes of resistance, this coalescing of autocratic regimes that will undermine the liberal international order. But we see that they're not faithful to one another. So during the 12-day war, Iran saw that it was completely isolated. China didn't come to its assistance. Russia didn't come to its assistance in any way. It was completely alone. So in a sense, that's how they are paper tigers. I completely also agree with you on the fact that the opposition is not hierarchical. It doesn't have a leadership. It's completely flat and decentralized. And indeed, the regime always attempts to keep it that way. And as a result of that, at this stage, measures that should be put in place should be coordination and communication capabilities that will allow them to coordinate amongst themselves. That may begin to create some type of structure, but I don't see Western nations at all put that in place, and that enables the regime to keep the opposition flat.
I agree, but with the second remark, but with the first one, with all due respect, I don't. I don't think that we can compare the relations between China and Russia and Iran to the relations that Iran had with Hamas, especially Hezbollah and the Syrian regime. But the investment of Iran in those three elements was huge, probably hundreds of billions of dollars. There were its proxies. They had a strategy which connected them together and built something that supposedly supposed to collapse the state of Israel. So it is not the same relations that the Chinese or the Russians had with Iran, and you cannot say that the Chinese or the Russians didn't deliver when they didn't come to save Iran in the 12 days. You can say it strongly about the Iranians when they didn't help Hamas, for sure when they didn't help Hezbollah, and even more so when they didn't come to help to save the regime. It was part of the Shiite crescent, which was lost because of that. I mean, it's a totally different situation, and the feeling of not delivering is much stronger when it is coming to Iran and Hezbollah or Syria than China and Russia regarding Tehran.
Thank you. Elliot, would you be interested in please sharing your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to Sima and Tal and Yaakov for their comments. A few remarks. First, on the question of the use of military power against Iran, I would disagree, I think, with the remark you made right at the beginning, which was that there are severe limits on that because it will rally the Iranian people to the regime out of sheer nationalism. That needs to be proved. That is, it's an assertion. It may be right. I'm not sure it's right at all, and it depends partly on the kind of military power being used and whether the population feels it. I mean, there's a difference between hitting Natanz and hitting Tehran, for example. That's just one remark. It has struck me listening to this that, you know, if we go back to the Cold War, you know, the containment model of George Kennan was a model that suggested that if we contain them internationally outside their borders, then the contradictions inside will ultimately lead to the collapse of the regime. The idea was not containment for 200 years. The idea was containment so that they could not do damage to our interests while things festered inside. And there wasn't much that we did inside. Yes, we had the US Information Agency and we shipped, you know, faxes, and we had Voice of America. But there wasn't a huge effort to subvert the regime. The idea was that the internal contradictions would ultimately collapse the regime. So one aspect of this, I think, that we absolutely have to do is at least the containment. While we're waiting for the regime to collapse, which I agree with Yaakov could be a long time, and we have not done that until very recently, until Israel did it in the case of Syria, in the case of particularly of Lebanon. But the West in general and the US, you know, has not been, for example, particularly aggressive in the case of Yemen. And it seems to me that if you look at this picture from Tehran, you've kind of lost Lebanon, and it doesn't look as if it will be recovered soon. Same with Syria. You certainly don't want to lose Iraq. And I think Iraq will become an interesting kind of battlefield here as the Iranians desperately try to retain or maybe increase their influence, and there will be Iraqis who try to resist that. One of the things I think we ought to think about as we think about, well, what can we do to support the Iranian opposition, is just think around the corner about the period which will come reasonably soon after the death of Khamenei. It's conventional wisdom, and I think it's probably right, that there will never be another supreme leader who's really supreme. That is, in the sense that he could give orders to Soleimani, and that they would not be questioned. He could can give orders to the IRGC. I don't think the next supreme leader is going to be that supreme. The conventional wisdom, again, with which I agree, is that the IRGC will have greater influence. And it raises an interesting question about the militarization of the regime and about the clergy, which played such a key role, obviously, in the collapse of the Shah's regime. What does the Iranian clergy look like 5 years after Khamenei, or 10? What is its attitude toward the government, in which it has less and less power and influence, and maybe is receiving fewer and fewer benefits? Surely there are many in the Iranian clergy who recognize that their affiliation with the regime has destroyed Shiism in Iran. So it's a question I raise about the future of the Iranian clergy. I am pessimistic, I would say, about our ability to effect the collapse of the regime, just because, where have we done it effectively? Where have we really known what the internal processes were? A week before Mubarak basically collapsed, Hillary Clinton was saying the regime is stable. We just didn't know. Reagan thought the Soviet regime would collapse at some point, but if you had said to him in 1988, it'll happen in 3 years, I think he would have said, well, 30 years, maybe. So we just, we're not good at figuring this out, in the US anyway, and figuring out what precisely to do to advance that cause. I think that's one of the reasons your report is so interesting and useful. But, the US, unfortunately, is now diminishing our ability to be helpful here as we take apart, for example, US international broadcasting, which wasn't so great when it came to Iran anyway. But weakening it is certainly not going to help us build our influence.
Thank you, Elliot. I've got so many things to say based on what you have just said. I'll start with the first point. The first thing is you mentioned the internal contradictions, and I think that's directly connected with your point about what happens the day after. With internal contradictions, what I fear is, when you say the supreme leader won't be as supreme, well, that's also an assertion because it is also possible that you may have the IRGC taking over or nationalists taking over that also has an anti-Western posture, that also wants, so basically, same thing, different day, right? That is worrying. Watching it, just observing internal contradictions play out while they remain committed to exporting terrorism, building up their ballistic missiles, reconstituting its nuclear program. So I just don't feel that we have the luxury to watch the internal contradictions play out.
I would suggest that we sit back and watch. For example, I would like to see much stronger economic sanctions on Iran to try to diminish their oil revenue. I would like to see snapback instituted right now, next month at the General Assembly. We can heighten the contradictions by increasing various forms of pressure, military pressure and economic pressure.
Okay, and just one final point as well. I want to echo, no revolution or mega trend has ever been successfully predicted. The breakup of the Soviet Union wasn't predicted. The 79 fall of the Shah and Iranian Revolution wasn't predicted. And there is the law of unintended consequences, and that's an inherent part of policy in and of itself. The question remains, I would assume that if the regime was to collapse, that there would be chaos, that there would be infighting. The question remains how to mitigate that risk as much as possible, because the status quo is not tenable. I would rather have internal chaos that does not threaten Western security interests than having an artificial stability of the existing regime that its entire raison d'etre is to threaten your security. So that remains the question.
Well, I agree with that. It's hard for us to think through what kind of regime collapse could happen. I certainly agree with you that if I'm right, that the supremacy of the next supreme leader is diminished, and that the IRGC is more powerful, which is widely believed, yeah, then the foreign policy is going to get no better and might even get worse. And we need to be ready to react to that and to make it clear that we will not tolerate aggression and subversion on the part of the regime.
Elliot, thank you so much. I'm going to go into general Q&A that attendants have put here, and I'm not going to go in any particular order. Jonathan Campbell James asks a question. The GCC countries would like regime change, but are terrified about the potential for ensuing chaos, so are acting as a brake on more assertive action. How can you harness the GCC into a regime collapse strategy? And then there is one question here. Haider Tavakoli, Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi is by far the most popular figure with the Iranian people. I don't know, by the way, if that's true internally. He has declared leadership of the opposition and for the transition period after the regime change. We know that a progressive democratic regime in Iran is key for peace and economic growth for all. So why not invest in his leadership? Let's start with those two questions. Elliot, since you were the last to speak, go first.
My answer to how to harness the GCC is quietly and maybe secretly. If you look at the power differential between and size differential, population differential between Iran and those countries, they're going to be afraid. And their vulnerability is enormous. I mean, Tal mentioned, I believe it was Tal, the vulnerability of Israel to the Iranian ballistic missile program, which we've seen. Think of the vulnerability, never mind ballistic missiles, all sorts of short-range missiles of those GCC countries. How much would it take for Iran to knock out power plants and water purification plants? So they're going to be afraid, and they're not going to be certain that they will be rescued and protected by the United States. So their willingness to, I mean, this is why I think something like snapback is useful, because there are a lot of countries around the world that can hide behind snapback in diminishing their commercial and financial relations with Iran if they want to do that.
Okay, thank you. Tal, do you want to go next?
Yes. First of all, I want to say 2 comments and then address the questions. I think, pessimism is, I mean, the issue of dealing with the regime, many times people respond with sarcasm or pessimism. And it's understandable. It's very complicated, but I think basically when you look at the Iranian challenge, it should be a central part of the holistic strategy. I don't think the strategy is regime change strategy. There's a holistic strategy towards Iran where regime collapse is part of the effort. And I think the goal is, first of all, to restrain, to weaken, and to improve the conditions for future regime collapse. That, if I would need to phrase the goal, that's how I would phrase the goal. It means you need to think long-term, it's long-term efforts, and you're improving the conditions because at the end of the day, the collapse will come within. The second thing is that I totally agree that it needs to be a combination of diplomatic, economical, information operation, and military efforts. And a holistic approach and combination of those long-term might not bring the result, but I think the issue is so severe that we need to get on that court and start playing in that game. And the last thing that I want to address is that many times when we talk about regime collapse, we're looking at the 80% of the population that do not support the regime. Basically, I think we might need to look at it in a reverse way. The regime is surrounded by 10 to 20%, which those are the regime pillars. If we agree that regime deterring and weakening the regime in long term and going to regime collapse, we might want to try and focus on what are the efforts we can do to try and focus on the 20%, that kind of the regime strength pillars. Then that's a reverse way of looking at it. And that might, at the end of the day, enhance the 80% to challenge the regime, which is perceived to be very.
One of the points that I mention in the report is to also consider sponsoring defections of people around the regime. I agree that the support for the regime shouldn't be underestimated. And one of the points as well that you said about regime collapse being internally induced as opposed to externally foisted also addresses Elliot Abrams' point when you asked Elliot, when did it work in the past? We're not good at it. Well, I agree. That's why I spoke about regime collapse as opposed to regime change. We're not good at regime change because often it's messy. Not only is there the regular law of unintended consequences, but it entails boots on the ground. It's a foreign-led imposition as opposed to a foreign-led assistance, which is what regime collapse is. It's about fostering implosion as opposed to explosion.
Just one last comment, Barak. One last sentence I want to say is that I think, like the example of Reza Pahlavi, I would talk less about opposition and more about alternative. There needs to be alternative to the regime. I don't know if Reza Pahlavi is the leader of the opposition. I don't think there is an opposition. I agree with Yaakov, the way he described it, but I think there needs to be an alternative, even if it's an intermediate alternative for a chaos. You bring in some sort of alternative, and then maybe
transitional phase.
That's I think future discussion.
Hey, it's Sterling K. Brown from the Hulu original series Paradise. The next chapter begins as Xavier's search for his wife takes him above ground, and what he finds will change everything. It was never just about the bunker. Tune in and discover the truth lies outside. Paradise, the official podcast, is now streaming, and stream Paradise Season 2 on February 23rd on Hulu and Hulu on Disney+.
Sima, do you want to add your thoughts?
I think, first of all, it's much easier. Nothing is easy, but it's much easier to deal with Iran malign activity in the region and in the world and everywhere. And I think, first and foremost, this is the most important policy that the West, the US, Israel, others have to adopt. I completely agree with Elliot saying that the economic pressure should be much more. At the end of the day, Iran is continuing to purchase oil to China. The numbers are going higher and lower, but still very high. So the main dramatic tools that the West, the US has vis-a-vis Iran on oil, on banking and other, they are not used enough. So I think as generally, I would say we should first and foremost put our emphasis on those elements that we are able to influence. If we want to make sure that Hezbollah is not supported by Iran, neither by money nor by weapons, we have to have a plan how to make sure that money and weapons are not getting to Hezbollah. If we think that the militias in Iraq should be less strong, we should think so. Personally, what I think when people ask me, I always say, let's have a comprehensive plan on those elements where we are able to influence by having a better policy, which we don't have yet. So that's one thing. The other one, no question, when I'm looking on what is happening in Iran, is that the people in Iran, it doesn't matter if they are supporting or not supporting the regime, they understand the regime is not able neither to sustain the security interest of Iran during the war with Israel, and is not able to sustain the very basic demands of the population. If it's water, if it's electricity, if we look on the birth rate in Iran, very low. If we look on the separation between religion and the population, all the elements of the basic elements of the Islamic Republic are weaker by far from everything that could have been thought a decade ago. So I think we cannot orchestrate the way the regime will fall or will collapse or will be, or Khamenei will disappear. We should think about that, because once it happens, we should have the tools and to use them. And if there is a mass demonstrations on the streets, we have to support it. But I don't think we can have a policy that will be directed on that.
Sorry, I would just, sorry, I'll just cut you short with a quick counter before I move to Yaakov. Word that Tal has used a number of times is holistic. And what I worry about is having one set of measures as opposed to deploying the whole range of options in the policy toolkit. So, for example, when you speak about Iran purchasing Chinese oil, right? What I'm afraid of, if I agree that one ought to be putting greater pressure on the Iranian regime, but that needs to be accompanied by empowering the opposition and military intervention too. They're not mutually exclusive, because if you adopt just simply one set of policies, then you create a bounded order like during the Cold War. Iran will shift eastwards. Let's say you target their financial systems and ability to procure oil. Then Iran will pivot even more towards the east and become even more reliant upon the east. And then that has an enormous geopolitical consequence. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think that they're actually complementary.
We all agree on that.
Yaakov, before I go to the final set of questions, Yaakov, what are your thoughts?
I think that we have to think how we continue to contain Iran. Lebanon is not the issue. The fact that Syria is out of the bridge means that Iran cannot support Hezbollah with weapon system. They can smuggle something that they still have here and there. It's money. You can stop better than us by putting pressure on the Lebanese banking system. But Lebanon is not the issue. The issue to contain now Iran, the place to do it and to show the Iranians that they are failing is Iraq, in which you see some signs of understanding. Since last November, the Iraqis didn't let anyone to launch any projectile against Israel from Iraq. It was ended last November. why the Iraqis understood that Iran is weaker and they might pay a price. And it was clear for them that they will pay a price if they allow it to happen. And this is the place in which, this is the area in which America can make the difference, and helping those who are against the Iranians' involvement in Iraq to push Iran out. This is the only place in the Arab world, in the Middle East, in which the Iranians, out but Yemen, have strong influence. And for them, Iraq is not just a place, it's a symbol. It's the holy places for the Shiites. It's the beginning of the, I mean, it's a place, it's a country in which if America succeed to push the Iranians out, that will be a huge blow to the regime. The second remark is, look, I am very pessimistic about our ability to change the regime. And the fact that the regime doesn't deliver, the Ottoman Empire was corrupted 200 years. So what? And we are very bad of understanding how regimes are weak or strong.
Is Iran the Ottoman Empire?
No, just the corruption.
Yeah, is it?
But it's not, but the corruption is not, many countries live many years with corruption. That's what I wanted to say. I don't say that it is like the Ottoman Empire, not at all. We are very weak in understanding the situation of regimes. We didn't see that the Syrian regime is collapsing 48 hours before it happened. And it is very close to us, and we have a lot of information. We didn't understand how hollow is the whole system. And it's true about USSR and other examples. I say it only not to compare something to something, but to say that we cannot put a plan and be sure that that will lead to the collapse of the regime. That's all. And what we can do is to help the street by, not to organize it, but by giving it more information, that it will be known in Isfahan that there are demonstrations in Tehran, that it will be clear that they cannot block the internet because we are supporting them by some capabilities that the regime cannot block the internet, and so on and so forth. We can make more destabilization actions inside Iran. Will it lead to a regime change? I don't know. But if the regime will feel that his grip is weaker, if the regime feels that there are more problems on the street and the regime will be more busy with those problems, this is better for the Middle East to achieve, to put a plan which any schedule, any connection between what you do and the regime change. But of course, killing the leadership, this is something else. I'm speaking about not kinetic war in which you kill and you change the regime, but actions that you do on the ground that lead to it. I am very, very puzzling if there is any way to put a plan. Should we do whatever we can to weakening the regime? The answer is yes.
I agree with you, Yaakov, 100% in that corrupt autocracies are remarkably resilient, and their internal, and they to a great degree are able to overcome internal contradictions. I would, though, fully embrace a multi-pronged approach that includes both assisting the opposition in order to place greater pressure on the regime regardless of the outcome, but I would also include kinetic action as well. Just a final set of questions, one by Simon Redding. Is the Iranian infrastructure fracturing due to appointments of radicals despite their incompetence? And a second one by Paul Ivor of what you think is the role of Saudi Arabia towards Iran. That's the final set of questions we can take.
I want to begin with the last one, with your permission. I think that we are exaggerating in the readiness and the capabilities of the Gulf countries to help us in all these active actions. Under the table intelligence, they can help. But they are so cautious, and they have many reasons to be cautious, that we should do whatever we can to make all the plans that we have without taking into account that they will join us, I mean United States of America and Israel, they will join us in any active action in the coming future. What will happen in the remote time, I don't know. But in what we can understand now, these countries are not partners for open, active actions.
Okay. Anybody else? Tal, do you have any insights?
Yeah, I would like to address the second question also, because I think I would beg to differ. I agree with Yaakov. The Gulf countries will not be openly offensive vis-a-vis Iran, but I think there's a huge amount of potential for collaboration on defense, on deterrence, and on isolation, which are things that are, I would say, perceived less active or less aggressive. I think we saw an amazing opportunity to see what happened here last year in April and in November. Israel did not defend itself by itself. It defended itself by itself, but also with partners in the region, things that I would not have dreamed could happen a decade ago. So I agree that they will openly be part of a regime collapse strategy. No, but is there a potential that can be part of the holistic approach that isolation could be a very, very important, and they'll always hedge and also have diplomatic relations and try to mitigate, the direct threat that they have from Iran.
I would like to add one sentence to that. I think I completely agree that I don't think Israel at any time has been trying to plan its military plans, taking into consideration the Gulf states. On the contrary, I think they have been threatened by Iran. But I want to add one more thing. I think in difference from what was in the past in 2015, that the Gulf states wanted a military attack on Iran. I think this time they didn't want. That doesn't mean that Israel didn't ask them. But if I am trying to understand, and I'm talking to some that are in those places, they have other plans for the next 10 years, if not 20 years. They want economic prosperous, they want AI, they want the investment of Western money. And the last thing they want is to see a destabilizing situation in the region. A war with Iran is destabilizing their plans for the future.
And all of them came after the attack and hug us and say, thank you, it was very good and we appreciate it. All of them said it to the people that met them after the war.
Everyone met his friends.
Sorry, could you just explain that, Yaakov?
I'm speaking about leaders, not friends.
Sorry, what happened? Could you explain that, Yaakov?
Representatives of Israel, which visited countries around the Middle East, had been hugged by the leaders, and all the leaders appreciated very much the action. And
I would reconcile what you and Sima are saying simply is they wouldn't have wanted it from the outset, but they were delighted by the results, right? It was an enormous success. But Gulf states have to also be wary that it doesn't enter fantasy land like Israel did prior to October the 7th, being the startup nation and not necessarily being cognizant of what's happening beyond its borders, the security threat. You can't diversify your economies and create neon when you have destabilizing force on your doorstep, which is what Gulf states are experiencing. Elliot, could you have the final word?
I just wanted to speak about the other question that was asked about infrastructure. I don't think the explanation is that IRGC radicals have been put in charge of things they know nothing about. I think it's much deeper. The regime has been investing in its military, in a ballistic missile program, in a very expensive nuclear program, in sending hundreds of millions of dollars a year to Hezbollah, etc. And so the amount that has been invested instead in Iran, in its own infrastructure, in the management, for example, of water resources, has been very low. And these things have not been given the attention that a normal, let's put it that way, a normal government would do. And that, I think, is unlikely to change because the people running the country have their own set of priorities. And the Iranian people know it. I mean, why is the regime so unpopular? It's partly because of oppression, brutality. It's partly because people can see where the money is being invested. And that's why you get, at football matches and so forth, you get these cheers about no money for Palestine, money for Iran.
Look, first of all, thank you so much, Elliot, Yaakov, Sima, and Tal. It's just been such a high-calibered conversation from a really stellar panel that is just so experienced in the region, but in statecraft more broadly. So I'm deeply appreciative for you attending today and speaking. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for attending to listen today to the report launch. And the report will be sent to everybody who has attended by email tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for joining me for this episode, and please join us for the next as we continue to explore how geopolitics impacts the world at large and you. The Geo Godfather Wars is an Electrocast production. If you like our podcast, please rate, review, and tell your friends and colleagues to listen in.
Electrocast. It's tax season, and at LifeLock, we know you're tired of numbers. But here's a big one you need to hear. Billions. That's the amount of money in refunds the IRS has flagged for possible identity fraud. Now here's another big number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, we'll fix it guaranteed. One last big number. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit lifelock.com/podcast for the threats you can't control. Terms apply.
Why is it that games make us feel so good or completely rage quit? These emotions we feel are mostly not an accident. People like me designed them. I'm Chris Cross, and this is Brain Arcade, a podcast all about the psychology of game design and why games hit us so hard. Each week, I bring on a new guest, designers, psychologists, storytellers, to break it all down with me. If you play, design, or just love games, follow now.
Electrocast.